it was the most insightful. Not to say that complacency among us and secular humanists weren't as evocative, because they were, but it was the passage that I gave. I knew the passage was just loaded with stuff. I read it, I was like, oh, this is great stuff, right? But hegemony is popular by definition, right? And Pipla Pippo's response was absolutely right. It's like, to be popular, to be in the in crowd, is to be part of orthodoxy. It is to be part of the orthodoxy. The heterodox, right? Those outcasts, the marginalized groups, aren't part of the in crowd, aren't popular, and therefore aren't being homogenized, right? So that if you become popular, if you become, and obviously he means this, Nietzsche means this with respect to morality, right? His idea is that insofar as I ascribe to the traditional Christian conceptions, you know, as mandated A, B, C, D, E, F, G, what I do is I lose my biological determinacy, I lose my desires, my lust, my anger, my rage, my passion, my emotional connection to the world, and I spend my actual life conforming to principles, so that if and when I get to the afterworld, then I'll have a status of being the best conformer, is what Nietzsche's saying, right? He's like, what a waste of a life, right? What a waste of a life. You've spent your life doing nothing but bowing. And that's obviously going to rub a lot of people the wrong way, but that's Nietzsche's interpretation. He says, quote, "It is the pleasant feeling in us that we project out of us and bestow upon the good man as a quality, as a value." So that the individual then and the crowd, they radiate this seduction. We know what the seduction is, self-preservation. It radiates, it emits from the crowd. It's amplified by number. And more people, individuals, who could otherwise be individuals, want to conform and have that sense of belonging, right? So the whole point is, you know, insofar as I hear, again, not knocking the occupation protests, but as an example, insofar as I might be naturally in my day-to-day life a very shy, secluded sort of person, I might do things that I otherwise wouldn't do at a protest rally. So I go there and everybody's sharing their story and everybody's chanting, you know, everybody's saying what you say. So I might feel this biological connection because of the endorphins that are rushing, and lose myself, if you will, in the crowd, and become part of the crowd. Again, as I said, I think to do that on a case-by-case basis isn't problematic. I think it's probably a good thing. But what Nietzsche is saying is that people do this for the rest of their lives. They enter the crowd, they enter the mass, and they completely lose themselves for the rest of their lives in a system of dogma that tells them what it is that they are and how it is that they ought to conduct themselves. In the last section then, we're going to talk about unmasking virtue as vice. Virtue being the sheep, vice being the wolf, and the idea is that virtue is vice. That really all that exists for Nietzsche is vice. And that vice is understood in terms of varying degrees of vice, right? And it becomes a matter of semiotics, right? It becomes a matter of semiotics. If you call this type of vice virtue, sure. If you call this type of vice vice, sure. But what Nietzsche is saying is that it's wholesale equivocation, that there is nothing other really than vice. But we have, within the linguistic community, chosen to characterize these things, which are vices, or forms of vice, as virtue. So that's what we're doing. He says, it being virtue, demands too much extravagance of narrow-mindedness. Right? We can unmask virtue as vice because we recognize that in order to believe all of the things that you say you believe, it requires profound naivete. It requires profound narrow-mindedness. You can't believe that there is, and this is why I issued the call, right? This is why I issued the call in 170 for Christians to to respond, to give them, to give the Christian community the possibility of defending itself. But do you really believe that biologically you are physically, biologically going to be around forever? Is that the belief, right? And Nietzsche's like that. You couldn't believe that, right? You couldn't believe that biologically speaking, you as a physical agent are going to live forever, or that you're going to live forever but without your body. So then it's like brain in a vat. How does that work, right? But the point is, as he says, it demands too much extravagance of narrow-mindedness, right? Well, if that's the case and you appeal to dogma, you appeal to the institution, then I recognize that I cannot engage in debate with you because you're just going to make appeals that are just too narrow-minded. I don't have the ability, Nietzsche says, to be that narrow-minded. Second point is that he wants now to make the distinction between vice and virtue, and he says the following, quote, "Whenever one has not been capable of causal thinking, when you can't think causally, logically, one has thought morally." And that's note 327. And this is where I think Ian Mathewes Seven's comment on note 314 on the gut was right on the money. I would have interpreted this text differently, but having watched Ian influenced me. So hi, I'm Ian Mathewes 7. I can do it too, right? Ian said, and I think he's absolutely right. I think his response was genius. He said, it's not that morality is an act of reason. Morality is an act in almost an ethical objectivist sense of the gut. This feels like the right thing to do. This feels like the wrong thing to do. Moralists will say it's a thumbs up, it's a thumbs down. It seems hokey to be like thumbs up, thumbs down. But that's it, right? It's granted, morality in a contemporary sense is extremely complex and there's tons of reason for it. No one's saying that that's what Nietzsche's saying. He's not so naive as to think that. What he's saying, though, is when we approach something so complex as an attempt to understand why a collective group of people conform and act in the way that they do, when it seems to be so anti-biological, right? If you want to have sex outside of your marriage and it feels like the right thing to do, and your spouse feels like it's the right thing to do, but you don't do that because there's some rule that some dude wrote 100 million years ago that you're supposed to stay monogamous for the rest of your life, and you live your whole life wishing that you could have sex with other people, well, that sucks for you. That sucks for you, right? Oh, Mary really wants to have sex with some other guy, and I really want to have sex with another woman, but it's just not the right thing to do. And then you ask Mary, and she's like, it feels right, I don't see why it would be a problem for us. And you say, yeah, it feels right to me, I don't see why it would be a problem, but you don't do that because, I don't know, in the afterlife you get an award. Well, Nietzsche says, not a problem, you've lost quite a bit, right? Ian Mathewes says it's a gut feeling. I can't rationally explain why I feel like, for example, this would be the right thing to do, despite the fact that the institution tells me it's the wrong thing. It feels like it's the right thing. We experience this in our life all the time. It's not anything more complex than recognizing that it is an internal battle against social norms, right? The norm is telling me how I ought to behave. The norm is telling me what I ought to do. And my rule of etiquette is, if it's immoral, have fun. If it's illegal, don't do it, right? If it's illegal, you'll go to jail. If it's immoral, well, debase yourself. Indulge, right? So Nietzsche, I think Nietzsche, as understood in terms of Ian's critique, I thought Ian's critique was a really good critique. Ian says it's a physical thing, it's not a rational thing, and that's exactly what Nietzsche says here. So I know now his interpretation was right of 314. So that 314 and 327, you can link those ideas because in the truest sense, this act of morality, and as Pippo says, it's not the case that we're talking about morality as understood for each individual agent. Right? Someone could say, oh yeah, it feels good to go and cannibalize live children. Right. There's going to be social norms against that, right? There are going to be repercussions for that. So we're not talking about you sort of indulging in your most debased fantasies for the sake of debasing your own fantasies. but there is a recognition in which it's undeniable at the organizational level, at the ideological organization. It's undeniable that individual human beings are going to have different connections to different modes of desire, different acts of pleasure. And the whole social edifice is to regulate those desires. Really and truly, the institution of society is nothing more, it's absolutely nothing more than really two things. Economic establishment, creating a structure of money, and creating an institution of regulating desire, right? Desires have to be regulated. Otherwise, you're going to have all types of insanity. But what you have to recognize is that the regulation of desire is completely arbitrary, right? If we were living in ancient Greece, it would be completely acceptable for instructors to have sexual relations with their prepubescent students. Completely acceptable. It's completely not acceptable now, right? So the whole idea is desire regulation in and of itself is completely arbitrary, and those who do the regulation are those with power. So if you want to change and make your desires acceptable, you have to recognize that you need to transform the social order. And that's the point. All right, last quote, Nietzsche says, "In short, virtue, appears as a vice. There is no court of appeal left that could deny it to us. Only by exhibiting virtue as a form of immorality do we again justify it. It is classified and compared with reference to its fundamental significance. It is part of the fundamental immorality of all existence." I mean, that's just gold, right? It is part of the fundamental immorality of all existence. Our existence is in itself debased existence. The act of putting on deodorant, the act of combing my hair, the act of brushing my teeth, taking a couple of shots of cologne, is to present myself acceptably socially. That has been constructed. Everything around me has been constructed to regulate desire. So what you need to recognize is that the desires that you have, you need to ask yourself, is it possible that it could ever be the case that this desire became socially acceptable? And if it could conceivably be the case that that desire could become, one day in the future, socially acceptable, you should seek to have that desire normalized, right? It should be the case. There was a time when African Americans couldn't vote. I have the desire to vote. I'm African American. Let me fight that battle. I'm a homosexual man. I want to be able to marry my partner. I can't marry my partner. Why? Could it be a time when I could, my partner and I could get married? Sure. So I'm fighting for that cause. Whatever your cause might be, you know, I'm a fill in the blank, right? That's the point. Why? Because all of morality, right? And when he's talking about immorality, all of existence is immoral. It's not that all of existence is about pain and suffering and all the vices in the world. It's that there is nothing other than our particular vices. It only ever becomes virtue when the vice has been co-opted by the institution. Right? It's only vice because it hasn't been co-opted by the institution. It was at one point in history a vice, but it's virtue now because it's been co-opted by the institution, right? So the vice becomes virtue. And the way in which that it becomes virtue is through the process of co-option, right? Pitler People talks about this in the discussion of etiquette, which I talked about before. And there's a link. The time marker is 40 minutes and 57 seconds. And then last 2 points, and we'll finish on that note. The fundamental immorality of existence, the interpretation is we seek to dominate and construct systems of domination, seduction, brute force, intellectual domination, irreverence, and we seek to normalize those vices as virtue. So for me, the idea of modesty, the idea of passivity, the idea of conformity is so vile and so ridiculous. I want more prowess, arrogance, pride to become accepted as a norm, because it is a good conduit for individuality, right? It's not that it's just me, look at me, look at me, look at me, but because there is a structure in which people can watch this process, they in turn can create their own systems of belief and then transform and share it, right? And this is the process that I did in the TMS system, justification-based truth maintenance system, in non-monotonic logic. Everything is negotiable, right? And then lastly is a quote. Nietzsche says, quote, "One cannot serve a cause better than by prosecuting it and hunting it down. This is what I have done." So, insofar as he's prosecuted morality and condemned, basically, moral valuation, he is primarily in the best position to offer sound critique and construction of morality, because he's so fervently deconstructed it. So that basically ends this section of the lecture, section 10 of Nietzsche's Will to Power. I want to thank you for taking the time to watch my videos. I'm Dr. Jason J. Campbell. Have a good day.